My sorcery will prevail.
This place is scary.
One October evening in 2016, an Arkansas farmer was sitting in his pickup truck just outside his field, and he was growing impatient. Suddenly, another car pulled up beside him, so the farmer got out. Seconds later, he was murdered. The farmer's name was Mike Wallace. He wasn't killed over money or land, he was killed over a herbicide. Chemical designed to destroy weeds. This herbicide spread fear through rural America, turning farmers against each other, all because it belonged to a certain company.
This company's policies, they pitted farmer against farmer, and they could just send henchmen to your door. Even if you just had the wrong seeds in your field, they could send you to court and bankrupt you.
In effect, they had a farmland monopoly. They owned more than 80% of the seeds planted in the United States.
And to get this monopoly, they played the legal system,
colluding with corrupted EPA officials,
twisted scientific evidence,
appears to have been caught red-handed.
but the chemicals they were making destroyed the health of communities all over the world.
This is a video about Monsanto, one of the biggest agricultural companies in the world. Our investigation is based on publicly available documents, recordings, and third-party opinions. All sources are linked in the description. In 1942, a chemist named Franklin D. Jones made an unusual enemy: poison ivy. See, his children had a very violent reaction to the plant. They would get intense rashes and swelling when they brushed up against the ivy. So Jones wanted a way to kill it. He experimented by spraying the ivy with hormones, chemicals that could regulate the plant's functions the same way they do in humans and animals. His hope was that one of these hormones would cause it to die. Unfortunately, many had no effect and others only made the ivy grow better. But then one day, Jones noticed that certain samples began to show autumn colors much sooner than they should have. He watched as the vibrant hues turned to twisted shapes, and then, within days, these plants shriveled up and died. Jones checked the chemical he sprayed them with, and surprisingly, it was a growth hormone called 2,4-D. It's an acid made up of a ring of 6 carbons and hydrogens called a benzene ring, with an acid tail. There are also 2 chlorine atoms in the 2 and 4 positions of the ring, which is why it's called 2,4-D. To keep things tidy, we don't have to draw all these carbons and hydrogens, but keep in mind they're still there. Jones realized this synthetic hormone was incredibly potent. Tiny amounts of it would still encourage the ivy to grow, but if he sprayed on a lot of it, 2,4-D would trigger such uncontrollable and unsustainable growth that the poison ivy would die in the process.
So effectively, he had plant cancer in a bottle.
I was just gonna say plant cancer.
Right?
Yeah, it's immediately where my brain went. What was even more remarkable was that it only targeted the ivy. The grass around it was barely affected, like it was resistant to 2,4-D.
So over the next 2 years, Jones performed over 100 different experiments by pouring the herbicide into many different plant species. And what he figured out was that 2,4-D was really picky. It killed broad-leaved weeds like dandelions, chickweed, and poison ivy, but it virtually ignored crops. Wheat, corn, and barley were all mostly unaffected by 2,4-D because all of these are species of grass.
To improve this pickiness further, Jones also tested chemicals similar to 2,4-D. He found that adding another chlorine to the benzene ring, transforming it to 2,4,5-T, left grasses even more unscathed. He was onto something huge.
Because up until then, farmers could get rid of weeds one of 2 ways. Either you spray them with dangerous chemicals like arsenic, or you have to pull the weeds out manually. Either way, you're at a loss. But with 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, you could spray your entire crop field, and only the weeds would die.
Jones had stumbled upon the first practically viable selective herbicides, so he was quick to patent them in 1945, just as the war was ending. After the Allies' victory, the patent secrecy restrictions in most countries were lifted, and it turned out that there were other scientists, both in the US but also in the UK, who discovered these herbicides independently.
Soon the world was blessed with modern miracle weed killers like Weedun and Weedabomb and Endoweed, all formulations of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T herbicides.
This man is ready to kill weeds because he's going to do it the easy way.
These chemicals literally replace the hoe in everything from farm fields to railroad tracks and sidewalks. And they are essentially what gave us that beautiful green American lawn, just grass and nothing else. Because with these herbicides, Dad knew there was no longer any excuse for a weedy lawn.
By the late 1940s, the herbicide business had turned into a roughly $10 million industry, and everyone wanted in, including one of the biggest chemical companies at the time, Monsanto. One of Monsanto's main herbicide factories was in Nitro, West Virginia, where they pumped out almost a ton of 2,4,5-T a day. By 1949, Monsanto's business was booming, when all of a sudden, the plant exploded. Over 100 workers rushed out to see a dark cloud rising 40 meters above the factory. They watched as a black, stinking powder started raining down on their faces. Within hours, many of these men fell ill. First, they got headaches and nausea, but then their skin began to erupt with bumps, pustules, and acne. The lesions on some of the workers' faces got so bad that Monsanto's on-site doctors had to peel off layers of their skin in an attempt to remove them. The doctors later noted that when these men are in a closed room together, there is a strong odor. They wrote, "We believe these men are excreting a foreign chemical through their skins." But neither the doctors nor anyone else at Monsanto knew what the chemical was, because both 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D were marketed as very safe.
See, when the herbicides were first getting introduced, Jones, the original inventor, even remarked that He knew people who would accidentally drink or spray the herbicides onto themselves, and they suffered no ill health effects. They were fine. And one of the doctors, after him, remarked that I've personally taken 1/2 a gram of pure 2,4-D a day for 3 weeks. You judge the results. It was the 40s, so people were a bit crazy, but yeah, it seemed pretty safe.
Back at Nitro, Monsanto analyzed all the other ingredients they were using to make 2,4,5-T, but they still couldn't find what was causing their workers' skin to erupt in this way. This is where their search seemingly stopped.
With no culprit, the conditions at the plant stayed mostly the same, and Monsanto just offered their workers a choice. Either you'll keep on working with 2,4,5-T, or you can take the gate.
For many, this was no choice at all, since there were hardly any other jobs in town. So most of the workers stayed, with something inside the factory poisoning them for years to come.
It wasn't until 1957, 8 years after the explosion, that a German dermatologist, Karl Schultz, found himself treating patients with similar-looking lesions to acne. He wasn't surprised by the symptoms because many of these patients worked in 2,4,5-T factories around Hamburg. But when Schultz would test these ingredients from the instruction list on rabbit ears he had at the lab, he would get no reactions. And this puzzled him. How do these ingredients do nothing in his own tests, but at the same time cause these painful skin disorders inside 2,4,5-T factories?
Well, to make 2,4,5-T, you start with tetrachlorobenzene, a benzene ring with 4 chlorine atoms attached to it. These chlorine atoms are very electronegative, so they want to steal electrons from nearby atoms. Luckily for them, the 6 carbons in the benzene ring are all sharing their electrons in these fuzzy donut-shaped clouds around the ring. That's what this circle in the diagram is meant to represent. The chlorine atoms pull on this electron cloud, bringing it closer to themselves, and as a result, the carbons in the benzene ring become slightly positively charged, and the chlorines slightly negatively charged. Now, if you heat up tetrachlorobenzene with sodium hydroxide, one of the negative hydroxide ions will want to bind to one of the slightly positively charged carbons in the benzene ring. And to do that, it forces out the chlorine atom, taking its place. This creates trichlorophenol, or TCP, a key ingredient in making the herbicide. From here, if you keep the reaction at 170 degrees Celsius, you can add a series of chemicals to grow out this oxygen tail into an acid, giving you 2,4,5-T.
On paper, this is all there is. If you follow the exact steps here and control the conditions, then none of these ingredients will explain the horrible face eruptions that the nitro workers were experiencing. But Schultz wasn't satisfied with this. Maybe the conditions aren't perfect. Maybe there is something in this process, some secret reaction that is contaminating the full chemical supply.
Ideally, the industrial process of transforming tetrachlorobenzene into 2,4,5-T should happen at 170 degrees Celsius, but if the temperature gets any higher, even just a few degrees higher, there is suddenly enough energy in the system for 2 molecules of TCP to fuse together. This creates a molecule commonly known as dioxin. It forms only in trace amounts, so you might expect to end up with roughly 1 or 2 molecules of dioxin for every 100,000 molecules of 2,4,5-T. It seemed too small to be a problem. Nevertheless, Schultz decided to test it. He took some TCP, this time contaminated with trace amounts of dioxin, and rubbed it into his own skin. And he got the same acne as the workers at the nitro plant.
Once Schultz realized the threat here, he immediately contacted all the big chemical producers in Germany. And one of these German companies even sent letters to both Monsanto and Dow, the other big herbicide producer in the US. And they warned them that the acne-causing effects are stemming from pollution through byproducts, referring to dioxin. They even listed when exactly during the process the contamination was happening and what to do to prevent it. Yet Monsanto denied ever getting these letters, and Dow said they somehow misfiled them. Regardless, it was obvious to both companies that something in the production of 2,4,5-T was poisoning their workers. But Monsanto didn't warn the public about the danger, perhaps because the herbicides were about to make them a whole lot of money.
In 1961, the president of South Vietnam was at war with the newly founded Viet Cong. This guerrilla force was set on overthrowing his rule and uniting Vietnam under a communist regime. The Viet Cong were masters of the jungle. They laid deadly traps for their enemies and ambushed them using underground tunnels. South Vietnam was losing the war, so the president faced a choice: either accept defeat in the jungle or destroy it. He reached out to his allies, the US, and asked them for help. And soon, they came in flying with thousands of barrels of herbicide. This was the start of Operation Ranch Hand. The US's herbicide of choice was Agent Orange, a 50-50 split of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, supplied by the US's biggest chemical manufacturers. The largest supplier by volume was Monsanto. Agent Orange ravaged through South Vietnam, destroying 20% of the jungles, and civilians and soldiers on both sides got sprayed with it too, mostly by accident. The government assured them that it is not toxic to humans, animals, or drinking water, but Monsanto and Dow knew otherwise. See, during Ranch Hand, they secretly exchanged information on their herbicides, and in one of the letters, Dow acknowledged that dioxin, which had been contaminating 2,4,5-T for years, was the most toxic compound they have ever experienced, and that even trace amounts of it caused incapacitating acne.
By 1965, it was obvious that both companies understood what sort of threat dioxin was. And yet, there are no records that Monsanto or Dow ever sent communication to the US government warning them about the threat.
In fact, Dow's vice president reportedly said, if the government learns about this, the whole industry will suffer. As a result, the US sprayed South Vietnam with 72 million liters of Agent Orange, within which was just 80 liters of dioxin. And even though that doesn't seem like much, the damage was irreparable. Civilians and soldiers on both sides suffered from skin diseases and cancer. Children were born with physical and mental disabilities. By some estimates, as many as 3 million people suffered from the effects of Agent Orange. This outraged the public. In 1967, 5,000 scientists signed a petition to the president condemning his use of the herbicides. And Monsanto was under scrutiny too, because regulators were catching on to the dioxin contained in 2,4,5-T. The herbicide was about to be phased out, compromising their bottom line. Monsanto needed a miracle, and they needed it fast. Their idea was to replace 2,4,5-T with a safer herbicide, but after 9 years of research, they weren't getting anywhere. All of the scientists in the agricultural department referred to this new initiative as a dead area.
One of the last remaining scientists on the project was John E. France, and by early 1970, he was about to give it up too. But before abandoning the project, France decided to do one final set of experiments. So he thought up 19 possible acids that could maybe work as herbicides and decided to test them out. He prepped the first herbicide, but nothing happened. The plant was completely fine and the herbicide had no activity. Then he decided to test the second herbicide, and he applied it to a plant.
I have been chosen by Amatis herself.
It was 10 times more powerful than any herbicide the team had ever seen. And allegedly, it made the plants super nasty. It made the plants super nasty. Oh, that was disgusting.
This miracle compound was glyphosate, a phosphonic acid group on one end and a carboxyl group on the other,